Hi everyone, welcome to the Communication and Conflict YouTube channel and CAOS podcast, promoting mindful communication and growth through conflict. So today's video and podcast is going to be revisiting the idea of psychological safety, which is something in which I've kind of recently come across and been taken with how similar so much of what that concept seems to be about relates to my experience and my understanding of mediation and conflict coaching as processes and practices. Now, I first of all want to acknowledge that not all mediation and conflict coaching is carried out in the way that we do at CAOS, but there are so many principles within what psychological safety at work seems to represent that it does have many similarities, and I guess that's why I've been particularly drawn to it as a concept. So first of all, I'll say what psychological safety is, as characterized by the person who's kind of developed the idea, who is Professor Amy Edmondson, who is Professor of Leadership and Management at Harvard Business School. And then I'll go on to say what she describes as the 3 ways to create psychological safety at work, and particularly the role of the leader in making that possible to have psychological safety at work. So those 3 ways, I'll go through what those 3 ways are first of all, and then I'll come back and revisit some of the things that arise that I'd like to kind of explore, both in what I say now, but I'm hoping also to have discussions with other people about this idea. And I'm also inviting your thoughts and questions and comments on what comes up in this video and any others I do on psychological safety at work, just to kind of put it out there and try to open up the discussion about the topic, because for me it's a great idea, but I'm kind of a little concerned that ideas don't always spread and disperse to the extent that they could do, and I want to look at what the obstacles to that might be, and also obviously the ways in which it can be promoted. So first of all, psychological safety is a belief that one will not be punished or humiliated for speaking up with ideas, questions, concerns, or mistakes. So I'll probably revisit that statement, but that was one of the ways in which I've seen Amy Edmondson characterize psychological safety at work. And the 3 ways that she describes that leaders can help that to be achieved are, and again, I'll introduce them and then I'll go back and expand upon them later. So number 1 is frame the work as a learning problem, not an execution problem. So I'll come back to that. Number 2 is acknowledge your own fallibility. So again, I'll come back to that. So I'll leave them hanging for now just as statements. And number 3, modeling curiosity. So those are the 3 ways. So what does she mean by that, or what do I understand her to mean by that? First of all, frame the work as a learning problem, not an execution problem. So from my understanding, what she's saying there is that a leader ideally will frame a project or an idea or an intention for the organization or for a team as a learning problem, not an execution problem, and that difference being that it's acknowledged that it's something which will always be developed and improved upon. It's seen as an opportunity for continuously learning and improving, rather than, for example, trying to get a project up and running so that then it just carries on, and all you've got to do every now and then is oil the wheels and check that everything's going round in the right way, which in itself can sometimes be quite stagnating, but also it risks meaning that problems with the situation don't get acknowledged because there may be some aspect of the project or the work that's being done, whatever that work is. So it could be any kind of work. So it could be working in a healthcare setting, it could be working in a manufacturing setting, it could be in a service setting. But the point is, nothing will be perfect. and trying to kind of just keep everything as it is and just keep it running efficiently isn't necessarily going to be the best way of doing things. Whereas if you treat something as a continuously learning and developing, almost artistic work in progress, then you're always innovating. You're always noticing where something isn't working correctly, or where some aspect of it is failing for some reason, and you're able to speak up and acknowledge it and change and innovate and develop things. Whereas if it's an environment where it's thought, right, everything's in place, now we're just going to make sure everything keeps ticking along, often it's much harder to acknowledge that actually the thing itself isn't working really. It could be done better. It's almost like upsetting the apple cart, or challenging the status quo, I think is one of the ways that she describes it. Whereas actually, anything, you might get any particular thing in place, and a year down the line, it's not appropriate to the circumstances, it's not working anymore. But it can be felt, well, we can't kind of bring up the problems with it because somebody might not be happy. So what she's wanting to create as being a possibility through having psychological safety at work is that those kinds of failures, those kinds of needs for improvement, those kinds of problems with the system can continuously be raised and looked at and discussed and innovated and moved on from, so that it's a continuous kind of learning and creative process. The work is seen as such. So people always have an engagement in not just turning up and doing the job, sitting there pulling the lever, next one pull the lever. They have a recognition that actually, there may be a better way of doing things, or there's some aspects in some other part of the project that could be done better, which would then help other parts of the project. So it's always being part of a kind of an innovative team and project and organisation if it's going to that kind of level. But in many environments, it may not feel that that's okay, because some people may feel they can't raise concerns or problems because they think they're going to be dismissed or shouted down, or, as she describes, when she says it's not, when there is psychological safety, that people feel they won't be punished or humiliated for speaking up with ideas, questions, concerns, or mistakes. So I hope that kind of frames what I mean by, or as she says, frames the work as a learning problem, not an execution problem. Obviously there's more that we can look into as to what she actually means, but I hope that kind of distinction is there. It's not just get something in place and just make sure it keeps running. It's about looking at, well, is it still appropriate? Could it still be improved? Is there more about what we originally created that could be improved upon and developed? But it needs people to be able to say that for that to happen. And it needs a leader to be open to hearing it as well, rather than one that just says, no, it's all fine. All we've got to do is make sure it keeps working as it is now. They're open to hearing, well, actually, yeah, could we do this a little bit better? So acknowledge our own fallibility. So what she's saying there is that a leader needs to be able to say that they make mistakes, that they have doubts, that they're not sure about things, that they recognise there may be gaps in their understanding, that they may not know what other people in the project are having to do and what their challenges are, and that they need to be able to hear those things, and they need to be, as she calls it, inviting input as a necessary thing, rather than just looking for everybody to say, yep, everything's fine, yep, everything's fine, everything's fine. I mean, what some people might have said in the past, being a yes man or yes woman, yes person, yes, whatever, someone who's always just saying yes, 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 everything's great, when actually they know it's not necessarily, but they feel they can't say it because it might reflect badly on them, rather than accept it as a kind of a shared problem. And a leader, she says, needs to be able to acknowledge their own kind of limitations and their own fallibilities, because that then encourages or shows that it's possible for anybody to do that. and there's things about this that I want to kind of go back to, but that's what she's suggesting, is that if you acknowledge that you're fallible, then other people will feel safer to acknowledge that they've made mistakes as well. And then the third one is modeling curiosity. So inviting input and thoughts and ideas about the work. So being willing to kind of ask questions, being willing to embrace the feedback that people are giving, that they now hopefully feel psychologically safe enough to do, so that rather than just say that we want psychological safety, to actually then kind of embrace it, to actually encourage it, to encourage the possibility for people to say what's on their mind and what their concerns are, so that it really does value that people are being invited to share their thoughts and feelings about things, and their viewpoints and their disagreements about things, and their views about how things could be done better, or to be willing to identify the things that are not working, etc. So to encourage that, and to show curiosity about it. And again, I'll probably come a bit more about that when I review some of these things, but one of the things she's spoken about is the idea of using questions that invite that. So an example might be that something is presented to in a meeting, and instead of saying, does anybody have a different view, which I think she described really well as it kind of suggesting that it's almost like, is anybody willing to just kind of say, no, I'm not sure, or you're all going to kind of toe the line? Whereas if you say who has a different perspective, it's kind of saying, there must be somebody out there who's got a different view on this, and that's going to be useful for us to hear. So just being aware of how we ask questions like that, which again I would say is very much something which mediation is very aware of and very committed to, and the skills and practices in mediation very much recognise that important distinction between those two questions. So as I say, I want to go back over some of these things because as ideas, I think they're great, and very kind of I very much agree with the thinking behind it, that if it's if it's going to be an open and creative and exciting and innovative project that we're working on, and for me, my experience obviously is working in the fields of mediation and conflict coaching, and seeing that as a very much a kind of an ongoing development and reflective practice, and something which we can always kind of come to understand more about ourselves and our challenges in working with people with conflict. I would say certainly within CAOS, there's a kind of an openness to looking at these things, to seeing it as an ongoing development of understanding of what the work that we do. But there are certain aspects of the language that I and other colleagues have kind of mentioned about this that I'm kind of wondering whether they could be looked at even more. So, for example, the idea of creating psychological safety at work. Now, I would say I can never create a feeling of safety for someone else. I can do all that I can to try to optimize that possibility, but at the end of the day, it's that person who has the feeling. So I think to frame it as creating psychological safety at work for others almost overlooks the importance of others also being engaged in it, so that they bring their part to creating safety at work. And I think in itself that's more safe to see it that way, because if there's a sense of dependence on one person, i.e. the leader, to create that safety, it suggests that people can't have it without the leader. So there's a dependence on them, which in mediation, or in our model of mediation, we call there being a parent-child relationship. And a parent-child relationship is a very dependent relationship. And obviously if the child is bereft of their parent, they're in a very vulnerable place. So it's preferable to have what we call an adult relationship. So of course the leader can be the person to kind of initiate the idea, but there's also got to be a participation and a contribution from everybody else in also supporting the possibility of psychological safety at work. So I'm a little, I've used it as a phrase, but I'm a little bit questioning of the idea of a leader creating psychological safety at work. I think they can support it. I think they can optimize its possibilities. I think that a leader can introduce it as a concept in order to involve people in creating it together, but I don't see it as something that can only be in the hands of the leader, because it does create that kind of dependency. And also, it makes it less likely that it's sustainable, because if it's seen that it's only the leader that kind of is the crucial part of there being psychological safety at work, if that leader goes somewhere else, leaves, moves to another department, whatever, it suggests that that's no longer a possibility. So it has to be, I would say, something that everybody contributes to. But, it may well be that in other places, Amy Edmondson has addressed that issue, but I would always kind of want to look at, can I create safety for someone else, or do they ultimately have to be the ones who, well, they are the ones who ultimately have the feeling, but I can look at what optimizes their sense of safety if I'm the leader, but I can't do it for them. So there has to be that clear engagement between the leader and other people, rather than it be seen that the leader is the person who creates it. And I also think that sometimes it just means it then gets passed as like, oh yeah, the leader's going to sort that out. Psychological safety, yeah, the leader will sort that out, as if the rest of the team don't have any part to play in it. It's got to be something the leader brings in. Acknowledgement of our own fallibility, that's a great one, because it is saying it's okay to make mistakes, which is one of the principles that we operate by, that we support people in acknowledging through the work of mediation. We try to create a space in which they feel able to talk about the things that it's possible for them to feel. As I say, I can't make them feel this way, but the aim is to explore things that haven't worked well, so that they are given the opportunity to consider what they could have done differently. And for me, that is acknowledging that possibility of fallibility that anybody has. Excuse me. And then modelling curiosity. I would see that as in mediation very much being about the kind of the commitment to listening to and witnessing what people have to say, without there being a sense of having to respond to it, to fix it, to answer it, to give an opinion about it. Because as a mediator, we don't do any of those things. We're there to give people space to express what their concerns are, and then to kind of help them to reflect on those concerns and decide what they might want to do about those things in a difficult relationship with somebody else, in a bullying allegation at work, in a neighbour dispute, whatever it is. So for me, it's kind of intrinsic to the process of mediation and the practices of mediation to be curious, to model curiosity. But what she's saying for the leader is to, as I say, to model curiosity, so that it shows that the practice of asking questions is one that is seen as okay to do within the workplace, to ask questions, to say, what led you to raise that concern? What were your fears about that? What is it you think could happen? What could be a better way forward in the situation? What if that isn't possible? What else could we do that addresses this issue that you're raising? So always asking questions, but also the other part of this is to be, clear that those answers that people might give to those questions are valued, rather than dismissed, rather than just say, no, I don't agree with that, that's rubbish, etc. It's say, okay, let's explore that further, and thanks for that as an input, from a leader or a manager or a chief exec or whoever. that's an important part of how they conduct themselves. So they are, if they ask questions, that they value that somebody has been willing to give an answer, to step into that slightly vulnerable zone of saying, actually, I've got a different view on this, and for the person to be, the leader, to be willing to hear it, rather than feel perhaps they've got to defend against it, or to not want to address it because it might upset the status quo, and we've got a deadline to reach, and let's not look at those things because we've got to carry on with our job. So that then, in a sense, the leader is no longer a leader; they're just a kind of an overseer of a kind of mechanism which is carrying on. They're not looking at adjusting the mechanism, changing it, completely replacing it, even. So therefore, if they're not willing to kind of really take in what people have to say, then they're not allowing for that kind of learning problem approach to the work. They are treating it as just simply executing the job and kind of getting it done. So yeah, kind of those are my thoughts upon it. There are some kind of, as I say, some kind of ambiguities for me in terms of that idea of almost dependence on the leader, and I would want to really challenge that because I think it's where a lot of ideas fall down. There can be a lot of these things that say, I don't know, just as an example, all organisations' leaders should have an effective equality and diversity policy, and it's like, yeah, everybody should have an effective, and it's like, but who's going to ensure that happens? What do we mean by an effective policy? What are the things that actually matter to people in having that policy? The detail of it and the clarity as to who, rather than someone must or someone will. And it's such a common thing in so many organisations where it's like, oh yes, we must this. And it's like, okay, we must, but who? So often with a lot of ideas, it can be put forward as to what should happen, but it's not always clarified the who does it and the how it's done. And sometimes, even if there is a who that does it, the idea that it's just down to one person, it kind of doesn't make sense for just one person to do it. It should always be an engaged activity with various people, because otherwise it just won't work, because it's not taking in those different perspectives. So these are the kinds of things that I would want to ask more about and explore more about in relation to, in this aspect, creating the three ways to create psychological safety at work. Yeah, I think for now that's it. That's all I'm going to say. I just want to kind of introduce those three ways to raise what I understand them to be, but also to raise the kinds of challenges that I would have about them as ideas. And I guess for me, the strongest kind of concern I have about those three is this idea, for me, the absence of talking about how everybody gets involved in it, because it's most frequently said that it's the leader that's got to do it. And I kind of almost think that's a little bit contradictory within the whole notion of it, because it's got to be everyone. If it's not everybody that's involved in one way or another, then it can't work, because it can't just be the leader that's promoting these activities and ideas. Everybody's got to be involved in it, and everybody's got to understand what is meant by it. Otherwise, even if they're experiencing these behaviours and practices by the leader, they may not even be kind of conscious that that's supporting them in being safer, and therefore they may not transfer those behaviours by themselves into their interactions with other people. They may say, oh, their leader's great, you can talk to them, but that doesn't mean to say the next person in their team they feel they can talk to. So therefore it kind of limits the potential for how far it can go, I would say. And I think with all of these things, it's entirely possible for that to be so. But I just think at the moment it's not clear in what I've seen and read about how that's possible. And I do think there are many ways that, as I say, I would draw upon from mediation thinking and practice that can actually enable that to be expanded upon and those gaps that I've mentioned to be filled. But anyway, that's me. I'm going to leave it there. Please give me any thoughts and comments that you have about this. If you'd like to hear other ones, other videos that I do and podcasts that I do on psychological safety at work, please subscribe. Please subscribe anyway, please, because then, you know, the numbers go up and more people get to hear about the things that I'm discussing, those that have an interest in it. Please like the video, please share it to other people if you think they'd be interested. Because I see this discussion around psychological safety at work as being kind of perhaps a little bit of a journey that I want to go on. And as I say, to have discussions with some other people about it. Maybe even Amy Edmondson one day, I don't know. But I'm certainly kind of interested in discussing with people what their experiences are of this and what challenges they have, but also what ideas they have for promoting this as an experience, is how I would describe it, as an experience for people in their workplaces. So psychological safety at work. There we go. So exploring the 3 ways to create psychological safety at work, the role of the leader. Thanks very much for listening. Thanks very much for watching, and goodbye.